Indonesia memiliki mimpi besar menjadi Indonesia maju di tahun 2045. Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga memiliki 8 program studi multidisiplin, hadir menjadi institusi berkelas dunia dengan kemampuan untuk mengembangkan pemimpin-pemimpin transformatif yang berdampak bagi dunia. Selamat datang di Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga, dan inilah program studi yang kami kelola.
Saya Profesor Dr. Teresia Indah Budi sebagai Koordinator Program Studi Magister Imunologi Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga. Prodi Imunologi merupakan satu-satunya program studi Magister Imunologi di Indonesia. Prodi kami ini adalah multidisiplin, jadi bisa dari berbagai keilmuan. Sekolah-sekolah yang berkaitan dengan imunologi bisa mengikuti program studi imunologi di Universitas Airlangga. Kami punya kompetensi, yaitu bahwa mahasiswa-mahasiswa yang mengikuti program studi imunologi ini bisa langsung terjun di dalam penelitian-penelitian yang mengikuti program dari penelitian dosen-dosen yang ada, sehingga mahasiswa semakin mempunyai wawasan yang semakin banyak di bidang imunologi. Dan juga kami juga menyelenggarakan salah satu seminar yang kita sebut sebagai World Immunology Day, merupakan satu-satunya juga seminar yang kita selenggarakan, baik itu tingkat nasional maupun internasional.
Kita disupport dengan adanya penelitian berpayung, pendanaan yang support luar biasa dari Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga. Kita juga sebagai mahasiswa mendapat support untuk publikasi dan juga melalui pelatihan-pelatihan berkelas Scopus dari Q1 sampai Q4.
Karena imunologi itu banyak bertanya, itu PR-nya mahasiswa online harus lebih aktif dibandingkan kalau mahasiswa offline, dosen ada di depan kita dan kita tahu, oh seperti ini, oh seperti ini.
Magister Imunologi Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga, hebat!
Indonesia merupakan wilayah yang rawan bencana karena dikelilingi 3 lempeng tektonik aktif dan deretan gunung api aktif yang menjadi bagian dari Ring of Fire. Kondisi hidrologi ini juga sangat berpengaruh terhadap fenomena alam. Kebencanaan tersebut perlu dikelola sejak pra-bencana, saat bencana hingga pasca bencana, agar berbagai upaya pencegahan dan pengendalian dapat berjalan dengan baik. Untuk itu, S2 Manajemen Bencana Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga hadir untuk mencetak alumni di bidang kebencanaan yang memiliki profil sebagai profesional di bidang manajemen bencana.
Yang baru, ada
Program ini memang dibentuk atau didirikan untuk bisa membantu para teman-teman pemerhati kebencanaan untuk bisa mengail ilmu, menimba ilmu, dan melengkapi keilmuan tentang kebencanaan. Karena itu sejak tahun 2012 program ini dibentuk mengingat bahwa bencana yang ada di Indonesia harus sudah diketahui oleh masyarakat seluruh Indonesia.
Kurikulum di program studi Magister Manajemen Bencana disusun berdasarkan kebutuhan dari stakeholder, di mana ruang lingkupnya meliputi pra-bencana, saat bencana, dan pasca bencana. Di mana perkuliahan itu menggunakan berbagai macam metode dan strategi, mulai dari konvensional hingga pemanfaatan teknologi informasi. Profil lulusan diharapkan menjadi alumni yang memiliki kompetensi di kepemimpinan yang transformatif yang mampu mengelola dan mengatasi masalah bencana baik itu di lingkup nasional maupun di internasional. Sementara untuk kegiatan perkuliahan itu meliputi ada bakti sosial, pengabdian masyarakat, kemudian juga mahasiswa dilibatkan dalam penelitian, webinar, pelatihan. Serta kita juga mengadakan ada conference, kemudian kuliah tamu yang melibatkan para pakar baik itu dari dalam maupun dari luar negeri.
Saya sebagai alumni dengan gelar Magister Manajemen Bencana, hal ini menjadi bentuk branding tersendiri, bentuk sebagai sebuah pengakuan. Nah, kebetulan saya konsen di manajemen pos koordinasi, dari bentuk sistem manajemen dalam hal penanggulangan bencana, saya bergerak di sana dan saya sebagai LO atau liaison officer. Rekan-rekan yang ada di luar sana tetap semangat juga dan juga mau bergabung di Magister Manajemen Bencana, karena di program studi ini kita akan dicetak menjadi orang-orang yang unggul, orang-orang yang efektif, orang yang punya dedikasi tinggi dalam hal kemanusiaan.
Melalui program studi Magister Manajemen Bencana, saya berharap dapat turut serta berkontribusi bersama pemerintah dan juga unsur pentahelik dalam mengurangi risiko bencana yang ada di Indonesia. Selain itu, pendidikan terkait bencana juga perlu diterapkan kepada anak-anak sejak usia dini, sehingga mereka memiliki kesadaran yang tinggi terhadap potensi bencana yang ada di lingkungan mereka.
Be prepared, be tough, be resilient.
Indonesia memiliki mimpi besar menjadi Indonesia maju di tahun 2045. Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga memiliki 8 program studi multidisiplin, hadir menjadi institusi berkelas dunia dengan kemampuan untuk mengembangkan pemimpin-pemimpin transformatif yang berdampak bagi dunia dan mampu mengembangkan serta mendimensikan pengetahuan untuk meningkatkan daya saing bangsa. Selamat datang di Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga, dan inilah program studi yang kami kelola.
Program studi Magister Kajian Ilmu Kepolisian merupakan program studi di Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga yang menawarkan pendidikan studi di bidang ilmu kepolisian. Magister Kajian Ilmu Kepolisian tidak saja diperuntukkan bagi anggota kepolisian Republik Indonesia, namun juga diperuntukkan bagi masyarakat pada umumnya. Metode pembelajaran yang interaktif melibatkan pengajar-pengajar dari praktisi yang ekspert di bidangnya. Profil lulusan Magister Kajian Ilmu Kepolisian Sekolah Pascasarjana Universitas Airlangga tidak saja memiliki kemampuan yang mendalam terhadap hal-hal yang berkaitan dengan studi tentang kepolisian. Namun lebih daripada itu, lulusan kami akan memiliki kemampuan sebagai seorang transformative leader, pemimpin yang transformatif yang berdampak pada dunia.
this experience related to resilience in SDGs. Please, the time is yours. Maybe the lecture get 45 minutes, and then we continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, good morning again, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi. So I will give you an overview of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's very important. And yesterday at the global platform, yesterday the global platform session, someone mentioned that the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, is supposed to be fulfilled by 2030. But okay. So someone mentioned that we will not fulfill the SDGs by 2030. Maybe it will be 2065. It will be me, because the rate we are going will not be very good. But I will explain why we are in that kind of condition. So just to know what is sustainable development. And originally, it was envisioned in terms of looking at the future generation, and this is what the United Nations says: there is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to be there. So it's the legacy we are leaving behind for our next generation of people, our children, and their children. So there are three main pillars in sustainable development. One is economic development. Without economic development, people cannot prosper, they need money to live, so that's important, but also social development. And social development has many dimensions. Then, of course, environment. So three main: economic, social, and environment. So these three things intersect in defining sustainable development. And you see, like here, you can see this diagram that it's an integrated vision of economic development, social enhancement, and ecological environmental extension. So if you look at those areas where the social and economic dimensions interact, that is when we get to equitability. So it's equitable. And I will come to this term again in this lecture later. When the social and environmental dimensions intersect, that makes life bearable. It's bearable. And if the economy and environment interact, and environment, if they all interact, then it is sustainable. So the key principles. Number one, which I mentioned earlier, is this generational issue of inter and intra-generational equity. Everyone has to have future opportunities for social, economic, and environmental. And while we do it, we need to conserve resources and create opportunities. And then the other issue, very important, is this protecting biodiversity and ecological processes. These have already been around for a long time, but they need to be a very high priority policy. This is to elevate them, that they are completely important for all policy processes. And then the other one is that the global dimension. See, we are all part of the same world. We breathe the same air, the same water. So this kind of interdependency of environment and development issue, that has to be really recognized and acknowledged. And then the integration of environmental, social, economic, we talk about this, and policy. Again, coming back to policy. And this is the integration principle. And then the other one is to, and this is very relevant to our disaster field, is to have precautionary approaches. And even if there is no scientific certainty, we don't know how the climate will be in the future. For example, it could be like serious, it will be irreversible, but we need to be prepared for it. And we have the precautionary principle. And then addressing indirect impacts as well. So we're broadening the focus. So only direct causes of environmental impacts and degradation, also addressing the underlying root causes. And then to involve the wider community. And remember in my earlier discussion, I talked about people who are marginal, people who are disadvantaged, women, children, to include them into this policy debate and formulate environmental management programs. And then number 8 is very important, is new innovative policy, new management approaches. And this can include all kinds of things like incentives, changes within institutions, transformation basically, and most importantly, community-based approaches. So just looking at the intersection of disaster and sustainable development. If you look at that very carefully, disasters have been negative. In fact, you can see the photograph from Aceh, after the tsunami, how the environment was completely impacted. And many kinds of impacts on the environment, dislocation, disease, epidemics, and the community can get destabilized. You are quite familiar with this because you've experienced disasters in Indonesia. Political upheaval and maybe political reconciliation as well. In the case of Aceh, it was an opportunity for communities to come together and become long-term partners. So financial crises also, and we had an earlier discussion when we were saying like disasters are not only natural events, but they also have many cascading, compounding impacts. And then disaster planning, post-disaster reconstruction, all these create opportunities for building back better, and we can address these kind of environmental impacts so that the efforts that are done afterwards, after disaster, will have deep, long-term impacts. So just looking at that, that is again, I was talking about Aceh. This was before the disaster and after the disaster. And I'm sure you're familiar with these photographs. But disasters have massive environmental impact. This photograph is from Pakistan after the 2005 earthquake. And you can see how the hills, landslides, it's landscape change, and irreversible landscape change. So this is a massive impact. So naturally, disasters impact on sustainable development. See that looking at all kinds of different issues, political, social conflict, financial crisis, environmental degradation, disease, these all interact in the form of disaster. They have a negative impact on efforts. So there are these different feedback loops. So the negative feedback loop is that you have unsustainable development, and that leads to increased vulnerability, increased environmental impacts, vulnerability, increased social impacts, increased economic impacts, and that leads to more unsustainable development. So we can reverse that. We can reverse it with sustainable development and say that it will reduce vulnerability, it will reduce environmental impact, reduce social impacts, economic impacts, and eventually lead to more sustainable development. So that is the basic approach. So, and we were talking in the car, we were coming back about urbanization, right? How big is Surabaya and how big Jakarta is in terms of traffic problems and all that. So, we look at urbanization, the process, which is basically an unsustainable process, the way it's been happening all the world. And so there are two ways that we get it. First, urbanization leads to demographic pressure, more people, and more pressure on land. Land, as you said, no space to expand. So there are two ways to go. One is to expand the land area. We go, and this is what is happening in countries like Australia, that they are capturing more and more land. So big cities like Melbourne, Sydney, they are more than 200 kilometers end to end, which is low density sprawl, urban sprawl. So that is what the name. Once you expand it, then eventually you cannot get suitable land. You're going more and more into the bush and in hospital areas, and the land is also degraded to the vegetation and the waterways. The place where I live in Australia right now, that used to be wetlands once upon a time. And the wetlands have an underground network of rivers. There's like a hydrological flow, natural hydrological flow. But what they did was they filled up the land, but the rivers still exist underground. So every time there's rain, you get water coming out from different places. So they are finished problems. So this is what land degradation can lead to poverty and reduce the other option is to intensify the land. So this has happened in countries like Singapore, for example, where you intensify, and that also gives you the opportunity for education, good ecosystems, law, all that, and sustainable land use, and that leads to high standard of living, and that reduces vulnerability, we have more safety. So if you have intensification, but if you have inappropriate technology and policy, then you can go back to the previous paradigm, which is the land degradation of nature. So now, with that preamble, I'm coming to what is sustainable development goals, and those were signed by 193 countries. There are 169 targets, and these are universally applicable, and they are measurable because the targets and indicators allow you to measure the SDG progress, which is why they can say that we have not made enough progress, which I started off with saying. So there are 17 of these goals. So if you look at that, and that is the General Assembly resolution, which was signed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and they call it transforming how we work. It's basically the agenda for sustainable development. So it is basically a transformative agenda. So that is what it was. So if we look at it, I can do this one video.
This September, 193 countries will meet at the UN to adopt new global goals. These 17 goals provide a roadmap that will help the world achieve sustainable development. But what exactly is sustainable development, and how does it affect us? Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But what does that mean? Everyone understands the need to grow their economies, but not everyone takes into account the negatives that unbalanced economic growth can have on the environment and on people's well-being. It's time to change that by looking at the world in a different way. The Sustainable Development Goals will help us to do that. Sustainable development is about the big picture. It's about improving the lives of everyone, everywhere, and achieving all these things together. But it's also about the details. That means we want economies to grow, companies to thrive, and people to have decent work. We want to create new, innovative technologies, but not by harming the environment. We want everyone to have access to nutritious food regardless of where they live. We want affordable and quality education for everybody, not just a few. We want freedom of speech, but we don't want that to mean violence. But how can we achieve all of this, and where do we even start? Well, the 17 goals will mean member states, alongside civil society stakeholders and major groups, will be working together for the next 15 years, looking at ways we can do business differently so that everyone gains. With these 17 global goals as our guide, we can achieve sustainable development and live in a world where people and planet benefit. But we have to act now. This is the time for global action. To find out how you can get involved and learn more about the goals, go to www.un.org/sustainable development.
This gives you a rough introduction to what it's all about. Yeah. Can I do a slideshow on this? Slideshow. Slideshow. No, we go down. I think the other one is better. No. Next time. That's true.
Bukan, Bu Fitri. Kayak ini PDF ini, bukan PPT ya.
If it goes like this.
Yes, it's there.
Okay, so we can continue. I'll avoid the slideshow. Yeah. Okay, so sorry about that. So when we talk about transformation, right? So what does transformation really mean? So we're looking at some of these SDGs. So this is the first one, SDG 1. It's about ending poverty in all its forms. So that's, I'm just going through all of that very quickly. And then number 2, it's so that's 2, it's to reduce hunger, so it's zero hunger. And number 3, it's about good health and well-being, and so it lives for everyone. So the health one, and then number 4 is on education. And here again, we talk about inclusive and equitable quality education. So promote lifelong learning, not only for children, but for us, for us. And then gender equity. This is number 5, very important. And all women and girls have to be empowered around the world. Because, like I said, that these are all universal goals. And number 6, it's about water, sustainable clean water and sanitation. So then we come to number 7. It's about affordable and clean energy. And this is very important. Now, presently the world is dependent on fossil fuels, that is not clean energy. And then number 8 is work and decent work and economic growth. So that's this is number 8, and this has to be promoted at all levels, sustained again, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. So that people have fully productive capacity and dignified, decent. And then number 9 is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Again, it's very, very important to keep the sector alive. And COVID, of course, had a very strong role on this particular sector. And then 10 is to reduce inequality. And I will talk a bit more about this as we progress. That this is a very important area throughout the world. And at the beginning, when I gave that little presentation, I was talking about this issue that more and more the world is becoming fragmented, and both the developed and developed countries. 11, sustainable cities, and I showed you that little diagram, that model on urbanization. So that is the kind of thing that you have to make these cities habitable. 50%, more than 50% of the population of the world live in cities. By 2050, it will be more than 70%. And some countries are already 70% population. China, for example, is rapidly urbanizing. So, and then 12 is responsible consumption and production. This is also an area which really needs a lot of attention, especially in developed countries where there's so much consumerism, so much wastage also. Then 13 is climate action. It's also very important. Within this, our disaster connection lies, and the urgent action on climate change. There are regular meetings happening, but climate change is still progressive. It has not Many of these countries have made commitments to the Paris Agreement, net zero by 2050, but they are still quite far from fulfilling it. And I will show you some of the progress as we go along. Back on the water, and this is also like many of these areas are so rich in biodiversity, but they are being affected. You perhaps know about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is a very large coral reserve, but that is getting bleached now because of acidity. And some of the areas they say that they will never recover. So it's a very big problem. Life on land as well, of course, sustainable use of biodiversity ecosystems, and to manage forests and to avoid desertification. Yesterday I met some gentlemen from Burkina Faso and Togo, and both of these countries are facing the advance of the Sahara Desert, and so they're increasingly getting to this side. So we need to maybe reverse those processes, because with this desertification, there's also loss of biodiversity. And then peace, justice, and strong institutions. Number 16, it's very important. And right now, we are facing a global conflict in Ukraine, which is affecting the whole world in terms of food scarcity, commodity prices. You must have faced the petrol prices. So it's a global issue. We just need to, build up our society so that we don't fight with each other. We don't need to. And that automatically leads to number 17 when we have the partnerships. And University of Newcastle was number 1 in this goal globally. They were ranked number 1 in sustainable development goal number 17 because of all the partnerships that we had around the world. So we can look at these SDGs as a network of targets, even though each SDG is separate, but they are interconnected also. And these targets, for example, we have SDG 16, peaceful and inclusive societies. And so they have all these different targets, but they're also linked to inequality. So there are these targets which are also common. They have common aspirations. So I won't go into the details of it, but just to say that these targets are interconnected. If you look at health, it has connections with cities, for example, with poverty. So there's 6 main elements to deliver the SDGs. Firstly, people, most important. So that people have good, healthy lives, they have knowledge and inclusion of women and children. Important. Dignity, very important. People have to have dignity to reduce poverty, to end poverty perhaps, and to fight inequality. So number 2. Number 3 is prosperity. We need to grow our income. We need to grow our income. So that, but it has to be in an equitable, inclusive way. And the economy has to transform, maybe more green economics instead of kind of economic that we know today. And then looking at justice, and justice for everyone. And the partnerships, of course, to catalyze it. And finally, the planet. Most important is one planet. The one planet has one main interconnected ecosystem. So this has to be preserved and handed down to each generation. So it was said that 2015 was a great year for our planet. The Paris Agreement was signed, the SDGs were formulated, and they said that disaster risk reduction was also established. And so at that time, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, this is what he said: be a global citizen, act with passion and compassion. Help us make this world safer and more sustainable today and for the generations that will follow. This is our moral responsibility. So just such important thoughts. So I won't go into this in great detail because then I will not keep to the time, as Dr. Arif mentioned. But just to highlight some of the key issues is that since 1992, when the first Rio summit was held, is that we started understanding that we are one society and we live on a finite planet. And so in 2010, though, when the Rio 20 summit was getting ready, we saw that we have missed an opportunity. For so many years, more than a decade, we have not fulfilled, even though we understood our limitations. And so then there was we looked at the MDGs, and MDGs preceded the SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and they kind of built up the action. And then the key SDGs that they were built, 193 countries signed up. There were people, the participants from all over the world came together, and countries such as Peru, Guatemala, United Arab Emirates, all of them kind of agreed to take this collective undertaking. So this is actually said to the former senior director in Natural Resources Global Practice in the World Bank. And so basically, this is the plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity, the 3 Ps. And to also understand that eradicating poverty in all its different forms, all its dimensions, including extreme poverty. This is perhaps the biggest global challenge. With poverty comes vulnerability. With vulnerability comes marginalization, and so on. And so this is just important, most essential for sustainable development. And so these countries and all these stakeholders, they have to work together in partnership, and this plan for transforming our world into the agenda for sustainable development needs to be implemented. And so you see the dimension, this is actually a very big global problem. And the Sustainable Development Goal 169 targets, they show the scale and the ambition of this. It's a massive, undertaking, really. And so they were expected to stimulate action in 2030 in all these areas. But now we see that we are not doing so well. So these are the 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership that comprise the SDGs. So that's the declaration, and this is all these countries, they agreed to the declaration that they will commit themselves to work tirelessly, and the resolution at that time, 2015, when they made the declaration, to 2030, they will end poverty and hunger everywhere, combat inequalities within and among countries, and to build peaceful, just, inclusive societies. All these are declarations. Also, the resolution to create conditions so that sustainable development, sustainable, inclusive, sustained economic growth, all these can flourish and peace and work. So the stuff that we've been talking about at different levels of national development and international development as well. And they also pledged that no one would be left behind. That is a very important one. That is the positive side of things. And the opportunity for the people at the back to come to the front. Standing right behind the queue. This come right to the front. And so this declaration, it has a vision, shared principles and commitments, and it's about our world today, how it is, the contemporary challenges that we face in the world. And this new agenda, it is quite unique because never before all the world leaders of so many countries actually agreed to undertake this mission. And also, they developed the means of implementation. How will they actually go about implementing the SDGs? Also, the processes and mechanisms for following up and reviewing progress. And so, yeah. So, these are integrated. All these, like I said, I showed you the diagram where the network between the targets exist. They are global and universally applicable. all countries with the different capacities. And then these targets are great, they're global, aspirational, but each government has the opportunity to set its own targets, so they can contextualize the SDGs according to their own national circumstances. And then each government, they can also decide how these goals will be incorporated within their national planning processes, policies, strategies, etc. And also to understand that the link between sustainable development and other ongoing processes in these three domains, economic, social, and environmental areas. So again, we come back to those 5 P's that I mentioned. So there's people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. So they are all integrated, and that is what defines sustainable development. So under people, these are 6 different SDGs, SDG 1, 2, and so on. You can see how they belong. For example, under planet, we have the different SDGs, 12, 13, and so on. And the peace is SDG 16, and the partnership is 17, and so on. So all these SDGs actually belong to any one of these 5 P's. And then under the indicators, the 169 indicators, targets, there are indicators. So there are 232 indicators, which can give you an idea of what they are. So I've just given a little example of goal 1 on ending poverty. And you can see that these are the different indicators under the goal. These are the targets, and under each target, there are these indicators. So this is how it's broken up. If you look at climate action, for example, SDG 13, the first one, 13.1, is about building adaptive capacity for disaster risk management. And under target 13.1, there are different indicators. For example, 13.1.1 is building capacity at the local government level. So it goes down to fine-grained nitty-gritty details. So now we need to monitor, evaluate, and then report on the SDGs. So this is a country-led process, and it's a national component for accountability. And then there's a regional component that is peer review, or the progress is reviewed by other countries in the region. And and then finally there's a global component, that is with the knowledge sharing happens, and that is a forum for participating on the sustainable review. So it happens at these 3 levels: national, regional, and global. So the thematic component actually for the SDGs, the chart, the global progress at regular intervals, and then to report. And also there is a component to review the global partnerships for sustainability 2017. That is important. That is where the University of Newcastle was ranked #1 in that global component. So how are we doing? Let's look at some of the reports that are coming out. So this is the Sustainable Development Goal Report 2021. So we had COVID, right? So that report, it specifically highlights how COVID-19 had stymied SDG implementation, and it identified the areas that required urgent and or needed action. And this report is prepared annually from the Global SDG Indicators Database. And that database is a link actually in this presentation. You can see what the indicators database is, and you can find this like a dashboard. And then, so the other one is that this global pandemic, the data could not be collected in these countries simply because of COVID. And the population censuses could not be conducted. So 42% of the country, they had to postpone their national censuses, which were scheduled for 2020 or 2021. So they could not get the data as well. And the other one is the global extreme poverty rate. It was for the first time in over 20 years. So 190 to 120 million people pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020. That's a lot of people. And 101 million children, they have fallen behind this minimum reading proficiency level. Minimum, not even like, able to read properly. So what were the key findings? And I won't go through all of them, but I can just tell you some of those. SDG 1, it was like projected to be 7% in 2030, and means that the target in eradicating poverty will not be achieved. So we look at all kinds of issues. Child malnutrition, 22% of children under 5 are stunted. So these are the key findings of the 2021 report. So life expectancy has shortened. All these parameters on which they were measured, SDG 4, 9% of children in one page fell below the level discussing earlier. Women's participation, SDG 5, only 25.6% of national, only 25%, quarter of the national parliamentarians are women. Only 26% of local government globally are, and 28% of the managerial positions are. So it's not a good sign. So we are not making great progress. So we can look at some of these issues that even though these goals of aspiration are built, but the progress hasn't been made. The pandemic, loss of 255 million full-time jobs. You're, I think, very familiar with that in Indonesia. So we can go into it in detail. 13 on climate action. Global average temperature was 1.2 degrees above the industrial baseline. And we were supposed to go to less than 1.5 degrees at the end of the century, but I don't think we have made that. SDG 17, if you look at the participants, nearly half of global population, 3.7 billion people, they're still not connected to the internet. Okay. We take it for granted when we're saying this should be on the internet. So if you look at 3.7 billion, half of the world population, they don't have internet connection. And you have to care read or write as well. So I will just show you some charts very quickly. So I'll just give you the legend for it. If it's green moving forward, then there's good progress. And if it's yellow, then it's some progress is going on, but it needs to be stepped up. And then if it's a triangle, orange triangle, then it's limited or no progress. And then if it's the reverse, red is going with deterioration. It's pretty bad. So that's a legend. I'll show you some of the outputs of that dashboard. And so this is the current level target met or almost met. So all of them are colored. Close to target, okay, one missing. Moderate, and then finally insufficient data or very far from target. So let's look at some of these different areas in the world. So let's look at our part of the world, Central and Southern Asia. And if you look at it, the different SDGs, goal 1, say, you see the developed countries, they have actually made progress. They reduce poverty. When you come to certain countries, they have not made any progress. There is no data also. You see, in Sub-Saharan Africa, I was talking about Burkina Faso and Togo yesterday. You see, they're very low progress. So you look at all of these. these. You see, like many of these have been met in so-called developed countries, but other countries they are very far behind, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at it globally, you see that even globally it's not doing great in most cases. It's reverse progress in many cases. So all of these. So I won't go into all of them because but you get the idea that globally it's reversing. Achieve full employment, we are going back behind. It's global. Even in developed countries, they have the same problem. SDG 13 is nothing, no data. And globally, if you look at this, you see that we are going behind in terms of climate action. So, just looking at two of the important SDGs, when I ask my students in the class, I tell them which of the two SDGs you think are the most important. And then I tell them which I think are most important to me. You don't have to agree to it. But I think number 10, reducing inequality, and number 13, climate action. These two are perhaps the most important ones. And we find the reports are not very good, particularly because of the pandemic. In 2020, more than 4,000 deaths and disappearances have been recorded of people who are migrating from one country to the other. It's illegal. People started transporting people to countries by boat, and people there, more than 4,000 people died in that situation. And this is the SDG report for Asia Pacific for 2022. The 2022 global SDG report is still not out, but we start looking at these reports from, and you find how Indonesia is doing here as well. So you see, like the blue ones are sort of progress since 2015. So they were supposed to be here in 2021, but all of them are falling behind, except for perhaps affordable clean energy. There's been some progress made in that area, but you see, climate action is going the other way. Asia Pacific is just going the opposite direction. So I wonder if you can see this one. Never mind. It's, can you play the video?
It's not working. Big one.
Yeah.
This is the first ever coronavirus pandemic in the world.
This morning, there are almost 43,000 new coronavirus cases.
The Anambra State government has ordered all schools in the state to vacate immediately.
Global stock markets have plunged over fears about the coronavirus.
COVID-19 is menacing the whole of humanity, and so the whole of humanity must fight back.
In 1994, the concept of human security refocused debate from protecting territory
to protecting people and what we care about.
Okay, so I told you I will talk a little bit about equity. And so this is a very interesting diagram. You see, like, firstly, this is equality. Equality means that the small boy So I think some of the other countries, interestingly, some of the poorer countries have done better on climate action. And those are measured by indicators such as they have a national adaptation plan for climate change. That is one of the indicators. Many of these countries actually have a national plan. Australia doesn't have a national plan. So, which is because they think that they'll hurt the businesses such as the coal industry. So I think unless there's, and the other problem with these governments is that they have a short time frame. Okay, they only think about the political tenure, 3 years, 4 years, whatever. But we need politicians to go beyond that, the long-term vision for the country, not only for their own political party. So I think that is where the main issue with this governance, has to be absolutely. I think on the United Nations is pushing, supporting many of these governments to do it, but they don't do so little that the United Nations can do. So, and many of the bigger countries, they don't listen. China, Russia, it's a global thing. That is where the challenge is, I think. That is why it's taking so much time to achieve it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question?
Maybe I have a question. I would like to know, Newcastle is Australia, right? Newcastle is Australia, right? How the government or the system for anticipate the disaster in their climate research?
What disaster? We are not as advanced as information.
Really?
Yes, because the focus is, if you heard what they were discussing the global platform, people are talking about resilience, right? But the focus there is still on emergency management. This year we had massive floods, and people are again going back and living the same. They're not relocating people, they're not changing anything. So every time it happens, they're responding. This is not the approach. I think they have to have long-term view, but they are not doing so well. Very emergency management. Many of our students cannot find jobs because they want emergency management. They don't want resilience practitioners.
So, but it's not like Australia has a good environment.
Sorry, what was that?
It looks like Australia has a good environment for citizens.
Yes, but we are getting disasters. We have massive bushfires, and people still have not recovered from the 2019-2020 bushfires. Still not recovered. Because many of these people, they don't have insurance, and so they couldn't rebuild their homes. So they're still staying in caravans. And so there is a good environment for sure, but I think things are becoming very difficult now. Property prices are very high. If you go back to 20, 30 years ago, everyone could buy a house. Now young people cannot buy a house. It's just not possible. The property price is so high, the deposit they need, they cannot do it. So this is a very big challenge. So increasingly, this kind of issues are coming up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to continue the question, Dr. Esther. So what is the role of the disaster management? Because like we already discussed, the source of the problem on the government, on the economic problem, diversity and others. So how we as the disaster management expert or student, what can we do to increase the diversity, to improve the result of the disaster education? Maybe you can share, or maybe you can have the experience to improve the result. Thank you.
So you're asking about the institutional arrangements, right?
Institutional, and maybe you have the research or other experience to solve the problem.
Well, see, Indonesia, for example, they have BNPB, right? Australia doesn't have anything like that. They have one main organization called Emergency Management Australia. That also is very underfunded. And so what happens every time there is a disaster? The local councils, they have to deal with it. Okay, now the local councils are taking people to work on this, especially those councils which are affected by disaster on a regular basis. But there is no national framework. They have a national plan, but that plan is not mandatory. They have the last disaster strategy, 2012, and it has not been updated. So that is the problem. And so who is responsible? Say like we had the floods this time in a city called Lismore. It was the council. And the council doesn't have the capacity. Then they get asked for help from the federal government to support them. Now, if they are not politically affiliated, they don't give them enough support. They only support their affiliated councils. And the thing with Australia is that the different states have, they're the two main parties, they're the Liberal and Labour parties. So interestingly, almost all the states, except for our state, New South Wales, all of them have Labour governments, but the national federal government, until last week, was the Liberal government. Okay, now it's Labour. So interestingly, I think things will change. There's only one state which has a Liberal government, the rest of them. But in terms of disasters, they don't have any policy. And they all make up their own policy. Each state, for example, during COVID is of course a disaster. Each state had its own restrictions, own regulations. There was not a national level. So this is how they're managing disasters at the state and local. It's not a good idea. And there's no ministry for it. It is handled by the Ministry of Police. So they treat it as an emergency issue, like the police. It's not an emergency issue, it's long-term resilience.
Yeah, because in Indonesia we have the community empowerment, like Desa Tangguh Bencana Disaster Village. Like a community. Like community empowerment to prepare for the disaster. Yeah, in the village. But actually, it's also not running well just for the specific place and in the district. I think, but if we can empower or support the activity, I think it's very strategic to improve the awareness for the community for the disaster.
That is actually very important. Well, there are some things in place. I should tell you that there's state emergency services. But again, they deal with emergencies. But now I think they're increasingly beginning to talk about resilience. And at the community level, they have all the volunteers, the volunteer firefighters, for example, rural fire service. It's mainly made out of volunteers. So they're trained. And if there's, so when you see the bushfire that happened in Australia, all these volunteers actually go and fight the fire. They're not part of the government. The government doesn't really support them in that sense also. They are not paid. So, but the state emergency service is the main one, but they often don't have enough capacity. They have to get help from the army. And for getting the army, they have to get permission from the federal government. And this year, when they had the floods, they took 5 days to get the army mobilized to go there for the emergency.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for the explanation. I think the time is running out. So once again, I would like to say thank you for the director for joining us in this guest lecture. And like director said that before we hope that we can still continue with other collaboration in the future related to education or the research, especially on the degree program. Thank you very much, Dr. Iqbal.
Oh yeah.
No, with the class.
Yeah. We have a picture of director.
No. See you next minute.
Three, two, once more. 3, 2, okay.
Thank you.
Dari kita mungkin Mbak Dani kita juga kita juga lihat. Akreditasi.
Ready? 3, 2, once more. 3, 2. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Prodi KIK tahun 2020 Sekolah Pasca Sarjana Universitas Airlangga. Di sini saya mempunyai kesempatan untuk mempelajari pengetahuan dan pengalaman-pengalaman yang diberikan oleh para dosen sehingga bisa menjadi bekal kami untuk melaksanakan tugas di kewilayahan. Kami bisa mempelajari perkembangan ilmu kepolisian baik dalam skala nasional maupun internasional. Semoga Prodi KIK tetap langgeng sehingga bisa menghasilkan banyak lagi lulusan-lulusan Prodi KIK yang bisa bermanfaat bagi masyarakat.
Nah, jadi bagi para mahasiswa kajian ilmu kepolisian, di samping memiliki pengalaman yang bagus, juga memiliki nilai akademik yang lebih bagus sehingga bisa mewarnai dunia di dalam bidang penegakan hukum. Smart Police, Impact to the World.
Membentuk masyarakat yang siaga bencana di wilayah yang rawan bencana seperti Indonesia adalah hal yang harus disosialisasikan. Salah satunya dengan menggelar pengabdian masyarakat untuk mencegah dan mengendalikan bencana.
Ini merupakan salah satu bentuk dari peran serta organisasi dan masyarakat di dalam upaya pengendalian masalah bencana di Indonesia. Keaktifan dari mahasiswa di manajemen bencana program Pasca Sarjana di Universitas Airlangga yang juga berperan aktif menjadi narasumber di kegiatan pemberdayaan masyarakat atau RAPI ini di dalam upaya pengendalian dan pencegahan bencana.